Hello and welcome. I'm Penny Thornton, and here I am with my weekly take on the astrology. What's going on up there? Well, this week I'm going to be talking about the main planetary event, which is one between Mars and Pluto. We've got a big, strong Mars influence this week, Mars-Pluto influence this week. But I think before I get into that, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit and look at the climate of the times we're living in. And I think there's no arguing really with the way things are at the moment. I mean, you've only got to keep looking at your news providers to hear that kind of litany of really depressing, terrible news stories. And in fact, I think about this past week, or maybe a little bit longer, the best stories have been to do with the rugby and the sport and, a few other developments that have kind of lifted our spirits. But basically, we seem to be in a period where there is so much polarity and division and extremism, and we sort of see that across the world. And I think that I want to set this week's astrology in that background, because sometimes I think it can seem as though we're like a bunch of lemmings just heading towards the precipice. It seems as though there is nothing to stop this kind of collision course we appear to be on, whether it's the climate we're talking about, whether it's conflicts here, there, and everywhere in the world, divisions in politics. All these things seem as though we're powerless to do anything about it. And I would say that, for us as individuals, each one of us, to try to turn the tide in these great situations that we see out there is not possible. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything. Of course, we can protest, we can bring awareness to light, and we can donate funds if that's what's expected of us. But I think in terms of really doing things as an individual, what we can do in this climate of extremism is really to handle our own affairs as well as we can, deal with our own stuff. And when I think about the Mars-Pluto aspect, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it really means perhaps looking at the situations in which we have conflict with someone or something, and perhaps we need to change our tactics. Maybe to forgive and forget is going to be the best way forward. And maybe it is to drop a cause because it's self-destructive, and we are certainly going to be talking about self-destructiveness in a minute. Or whatever it is, to change our tactics is the one thing we can do when faced with or dealing with the aspects that are prevailing at any one time. So yes, let's talk about these two planets. Mars currently in Libra and Pluto, of course, in Capricorn. And the thing about this Mars-Pluto square is that it's the kind of final event. There have been a series of really powerful influences starting at the beginning of October, and we've had Mercury, the Sun, and Venus all connecting, well, to Saturn and to Pluto, which is why this has been or presented us with such a raft of powerful and difficult events over which we seem to have very little kind of control. That's been the pattern. And this Mars-Pluto square that takes place on the 5th of November is the final one in this series. Of course, we get another raft by the time we get to January, but let's not think about January now. Let's think about what we have at the moment. And I think what's very interesting about this, when we look at an aspect that's going to be exact, and Mars and Pluto are going to be 90 degrees away from each other on the 5th of November, they don't just come and go like that in a split second. They build up, they come, they draw nearer towards each other. So we can go back roughly 8 to 10 days before Mars and Pluto are conjunct, and 8 to 10 days after. And if we think back on the news of last week, obviously very personal interest in what goes on in Great Britain. So the fact that Brexit didn't happen, but what did happen was that we have an election to come. And that means the voice of the people will be able to be heard, which is quite a development in light of what we've had to see for so long, standing back and watching all these parliamentary gymnastics going on, which has been very unpleasant. Now, it's interesting because in a way, talking about what we do with Mars Pluto, which is to maybe forgive and forget and to give up a cause and to move on, that in a way, Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, had to give up, had to eventually agree to an election. It's something that he's been stalling on, or the Labour Party been stalling on for ages, but finally push came to shove. And the same thing really with, Brexit couldn't happen on the 31st of October. So what's come out of that is a new tactic. It's the election. But also, I had a look today when I got up, and I'm recording this for you on Saturday, and I looked at the headlines that were on our news providers' screens, or if we read papers, what were they? And first thing that greeted my eye was that in Mali, they had the worst jihadist attack for 10 years. Moving on, we looked at Dresden. And Dresden have called for a Nazi emergency in light of what they see as discrimination against minorities. And then we have what's going on in the USA. We have the Democrats really sort of formalizing their process towards that, understanding or decision-making, impeachment, whatever you want to call it, with whether the president did in fact abuse his position of power and actually expose national security. And last but not least, Kashmir has lost its special status, and that really is a major, major issue for India and Pakistan and that little region of the world. And all these things are happening on that Mars-Pluto angle. Now, one of the things that I looked at really, and when I teach astrology and I'm really writing about astrology, is that I look at planets and I think about them being in the same room with each other. And when you look at Mars and Pluto, they're not very happy customers in the same room. There is always going to be an aura of, controversy about these two. There is conflict and a kind of adversarial kind of atmosphere. And of course, that will be pervasive as we go through next week. But of course, there's always an upside to these things. If you happen to be born with a Mars-Pluto angle, and we talk mainly about the hard aspects, which are the conjunctions, the squares, the oppositions, and the inconjunct, even though you may have the capacity to self-destruct periodically, to self-sabotage situations, you also have it within your grasp to be the great transformer for other people. And I think about this in particular with the late Princess of Wales, who had a Mars-Pluto conjunction in her natal chart. And I think we can see quite clearly the evidence, the legacy that she left us was this ability to totally transform people's lives. Funnily enough, or strangely enough, not only by her physical presence, but also in what she did. And I'm just sort of pointing to this Mars-Pluto conjunction here in the sign of Virgo. And very interestingly, at the time of her death, Pluto was in Sagittarius, just squaring this Mars-Pluto conjunction of hers. So there are many things, as I said, about we could look at Mars-Pluto influences. We could think about the splitting of the atom. We could think about heroic physical and emotional and intellectual feats. We think perhaps about the climbing of Everest, which was first achieved by Sir Edmund Hillary in 1953, and that occurred also on a Mars-Pluto aspect. So it's always big, it's always powerful. And if I rewind and come back to Brexit again, and I think, well, not Brexit so much as British politics, we think about the election that is to come, that I think the purpose of that election, or what will come out of that election, is going to have to be parliamentary reform, because we really can't have these situations where the country is in stalemate, parliament's in stalemate. And so the outcome of that election is going to create the next stage of huge, parliamentary and political reform for, the government and also for the country. So let me kind of draw this to an end and think about the Mars-Pluto effect, which we have at our disposal at the moment, and will be very strong as we go through the course of next week. What we can do, and it was interesting because this question was raised by someone who made a comment on my channel here, thank you, John, to question whether, knowing about these influences is in fact to kind of transform them in a way and make them, not happen. Well, that you can't stop something from happening, but what you can, with awareness and the understanding of what's going on, you can really handle a situation. You come at it in a way where you think, what else can I do with this? And I think that's the purpose, certainly, of my my videos to you here. So I want to close on the idea that, well, maybe we're not going to have a lot of fun on these aspects, but what we can get out of them is that they can be very purposeful. So I'm going to leave you with that thought of purposefulness. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now.